their life. And if we go back to scratchy politics, and the longer this goes on, the elements of tribalism are going to reappear, and it's going to make it much more difficult, and we're going to get into a really very malign political weather system, which will help no one.
It may not be constitutional, but the truth of the matter is that people have begun to see life in Britain in much more presidential electoral terms, and suddenly they're going to see yet another possibility of a Prime Minister who did not get elected as Prime Minister of a party running for office.
Yes, constitutionally that's perfectly all right. It's the person who can command a majority, or the confidence of the House of Commons, if not a majority. That's the key to it, whether they've been directly elected or not. And we don't directly elect Prime Ministers.
So that doesn't worry you at all, the idea that the person that would perhaps lead this progressive government that you and Gordon Brown have talked about wouldn't actually have presented himself to the electorate as the leader of a party?
The coalition, or whatever the government's going to be, a government or a minority government or a coalition, will in effect have to present itself to Parliament over the Queen's speech. There's no way around that. And that means that we will in fact have the...
Would that worry you, Douglas Hurd?
I think it would worry the people. I think it would worry the electorate. Because this is the second time this has happened, after all. And they think, well... OK, we're Labour people. A lot of people...
But you served under John Major. I don't remember you ringing me up and saying, John, I really think you ought to get onto this. We've got John Major here. He was never elected by anybody.
There's a difference between once and twice. A crucial difference between once and twice.
And John Major had a wonderful phrase about it. He said he felt he was living in sin with the electorate until he won his own election.
Yes, which he went on to do.
Which he went on to do.
It's been quite a long time.
That's what he said. Yes.
Well, there's a measure of agreement to end on. Thank you all three very warmly indeed. Now, after waiting such a long time to make the move from number 11 to number 10 Downing Street, Gordon Brown would have certainly hoped to stay there longer than 3 years. But after a short-lived golden period in the summer of 2007, his hold on to power has often seemed tenuous, undermined both by internal Labour opposition and mistakes of his own making. Victoria MacDonald looks back now at Gordon Brown's premiership.
Absolutely ashamed.
It was, in his own words, a disaster. But the fate of Gordon Brown's premiership was arguably decided long before he ever met Gillian Duffy.
Everything. She's just a sort of bigoted woman. Said she used to be Labour.
Someone has just handed me the tape. Let's play it and see if we can hear it.
She'd never have put me with that woman. Whose idea was that?
No, I didn't see her.
That's Sue, I think.
3 years after he took over from Tony Blair as Prime Minister and still unelected, he has now signalled he will step down. The man who styled himself as the true heir to the Labour leadership and who was at the heart of the Labour government for 13 years has recognised that he is the biggest obstacle to a possible coalition with the Lib Dems, that this is the only chance to keep Labour in power. After losing nearly 100 seats in the general election and failing to convince voters that choosing the opposition was laden with risk, he will now be gone by the autumn. It all started so well. He took office in 2007 promising change.
And at all times, I will be strong in purpose, steadfast in will, resolute in action, in the service of what matters to the British people.
He was praised for his response to floods, the botched bomb attacks in London and Glasgow, and a foot-and-mouth outbreak, showing voters that he was a man of action, that he did have what it took to act as a leader of the nation. This initial honeymoon period prompted a thought among his closest advisers. What about an early general election in the autumn of 2007? But Gordon Brown dithered, and the first blow to his reputation as Prime Minister was struck.
I'll not be calling an election, and let me explain why. I have a vision for change in Britain, and I want to show people how in government we're implementing it.
Can you say, hand on heart, that the change in the opinion polls was not the trigger for your change of heart over the election?
Yes, I can, because I've told you the basis on which I made my decision.
There were elements of bad luck in his falling reputation. It wasn't his fault the Inland Revenue lost data discs, but the image of the accident-prone PM was born.
The House has noticed the Prime Minister's remarkable transformation in the last few weeks from Stalin to Mr. Bean.
And in truth, the unpicking of Gordon Brown's abolition of the 10p tax rate could not be blamed on anybody else.
Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that the Labour Party have finally worked out that they've got a loser, not a leader?
By the summer of 2008, the first of what would be 4 attempted coups.
Well, we're not at war. Labour not are right here.
This time David Miliband, the would-be Brutus.
No, I'm not campaigning for anything other than a successful Labour government.
If there was ever any hope of redemption, it was the banking crisis. He knew his history of the 1930s depression like no other politician of his generation. He saw the need for recapitalisation of the banks and preached it like crazy round the world. It all came to a head at the G20 summit in Docklands in April, when the world gathered round him. They didn't back a second fiscal stimulus, but there was enough unity to make the Prime Minister's team think it might be a mood changer. Gordon Brown, side by side with the world's political pin-up, President Obama. But there was another political banana skin around the corner. His aide Damien McBride's emails suggesting a smear campaign against leading Conservatives.
Well, I'm sorry about what happened. I've said all along that when I saw this first, I was horrified, I was shocked, and I was very angry indeed.
Gordon Brown's attempt to lay down the law over the expenses scandal, using YouTube to launch a plan to abolish the second home allowance, fell flat and cruelly exposed the Prime Minister's difficulties with the camera. And by now his character had become an issue. Was he a bully, even prone to violence?
Do you get angry with your staff? Do you swear at them? Do you throw things?
If I get angry, I get angry with myself.
Do you throw things?
No, I throw.
You've never thrown
the
anything?
newspapers on the floor or something like that.
Have you ever hit anyone?
I have never hit anybody in my life.
All too late, of course, but yesterday the human side to Gordon Brown was shown when he arrived back at number 10 with his boys leaping around at his side. By now, though, he was being accused of squatting there, stubbornly, white-knuckled, refusing to let go. And today, that was no longer tenable.
The reason that we have a hung parliament is that no single party and no single leader was able to win the full support of the country. As a leader of my party, I must accept that that is a judgment on me.
Gordon Brown had lost not only the confidence of the nation, but of his party. And he finally agreed he had to leave the office he'd desired for so long.
Victoria MacDonald reporting. Well, Gordon Brown's long-time colleague, but perhaps not a long-time friend, Lord Faulkner, is with me now. I suppose we'd have to be candid and say you were unremittingly a Blairite, but therefore presumably saw Gordon Brown in a certain light.
No, I mean, I had disagreements with Gordon Brown, but Gordon Brown is an absolute lion of a man who has achieved so much for the Labour Party. Being a lion of a man, he ploughed forward at every opportunity. Sometimes we would disagree, but he achieved being the most successful Chancellor for a very long time. He was part of the people who changed Labour's position, and he had those 2.5 years as Prime Minister, which were difficult from time to time, but ultimately in the course of this election, by the force of his personality, he held us together and got a result that wasn't by any shadow a victory, but he held us together and we remain a force.
I like the words ultimately and held us together, because ultimately not holding people together in Cabinet was one of his problems, wasn't it?
There was difficulties from time to time because he was a very single-minded individual. That force he really needed in the course of this election.
It can be an advantage and it can be a disadvantage.
Yeah,
it was an advantage during the banking crisis, unquestionably.
But he was brave and he stood out against America and got them to do.
Disadvantage when it came to listening to anybody else.
Yeah, well, they were. I mean, he had his own view about things. From time to time, he would pursue a course that other people disagreed with. Because he was so strong, he was able to get through it. He dealt with periods of unpopularity during the last 2.5 years.
What a strange period it's been, though, because there was the kind of Icarus flight of Tony Blair, and then he flew too close to the sun, and then he was followed by this dark period of Gordon Brown. It's odd, isn't it?
Well,
I mean, New Labour is over and dead, isn't it?
I think the period of time that Tony and Gordon were the two leading figures in Labour is completely
But
over.
what a crash.
Well, we've held on. We've lost the election, I accept that, but we've held on. Nobody has won this election, and we remain very significant players in what happens now in Britain's future.
And as you look out over the playing field on which these players have to perform, do you see a striker emerging from the Labour ranks?
Well, I think it's very important that we have a contested election. Labour, above all, needs an open discussion about where it goes in the future.
Is there an heir to Blair?
Well, there's not an heir to Blair, but I think the best person in that competition will be David Miliband. I think he's got to prove himself in an election, but I think he will. I think he is the best because he's got the experience, the ability...
Not a loved figure in the party?
Not necessarily a loved figure throughout the party, but you need somebody of real ability and real stature. David's got to prove himself in fighting off all comers, but I think he can do that.
Lord Faulkner, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And now for some of the day's other main news from home and abroad. Back to Alex in the studio.